Then welcome everyone to the Grafo seminar, this time in English. And it is a great pleasure for us to introduce Dr. Patricia Matos to you today. Patricia received her PhD in social anthropology in Goldsmiths, University of London in 2011, where she conducted an extended case study in the Portuguese call center sector to investigate themes of labor precarity, neoliberal restructuring, and the commodification of labor. And since then, she had various postdoctoral grants, first at the Portuguese Foundation of Science and Technology, which you conducted in Lisbon, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
Then in the ERC-funded project Grassroots Economics, conducted by Susana Narodsky, based at the University of Barcelona, and now again one of the Portuguese Foundation of Science and Technology, which you carry out at the Center for Research in Anthropology in Lisbon. And there she investigates the interplay between shifting moral grammars of distribution, social protection, and conceptions of human needs during the austerity conjuncture in Portugal. She has also written beautiful articles and book chapters. I wanted to show you if I can find it. Yes, here you can see it, right? So she has written, she's just published her monograph, Disciplined Agency, Neoliberal Precarity, Generational Dispossession and Call Center Labor in Portugal with the University of Manchester Press. And she is also the author of 2 chapters in this new book, edited by Susana Narodsky, about the moral significance of needs and about body politics. And today she's going to talk about care as distributive agency, immediate needs and struggles for worth in austerity Portugal. So welcome, Patricia, and the virtual floor is yours.
Well, thank you. Let me first start by thanking the invitation from Miranda and Jose, particularly now in these times that we are living of pandemic and in which the opportunities to share our own work and have feedback and have interesting years, it's often rare. So thank you very much for this opportunity. Also because the paper I'm presenting, which is about care, the relationship between care work and agency in conditions of austerity and crisis, it's something that I started working while I was on the Greco research project. And more recently, I became interested in trying to build up a more sophisticated, let's call it, analytical contribution to the study of care by trying to develop this notion of care as distributive agency. So, and this is the first time I am presenting what I have been writing up until now. So I thank you in advance for your comments, critiques, and suggestions. I'm going to share my, well, actually, maybe there is no need to, because I only have one PowerPoint slide with the title of my presentations, which Miranda already mentioned. So the title of the paper is Care as Distributive Agency, Immediate Needs and Struggles for Worth in Austerity Portugal. I have 30 minutes, right, Miranda?
Yeah, well, more or less.
Okay.
Yes, as you like.
So in this paper, I examine how individuals and households have struggled to define and fulfill their needs of survival and worth within the conjuncture of austerity welfare in post-crisis Portugal. In 2011, Portugal signed the Memorandum of Understanding with the Troika, so the EU, the European Central Bank, and the IMF, binding the country to a 4-year plan of austerity medicine in exchange for a 78 billion bailout. Between 2011 and 2014, the government implemented severe cuts to state spending, harsh tax increases, and reduction of welfare benefits. Like other countries of the indebted periphery of the Eurozone, Portuguese policies of austerity entailed the so-called measures of internal devaluation, so wage repression, precarious employment, and mass unemployment, which in fact contributed to the most violent and rapid transfer of income from labor to capital in democratic Portugal, so since 1974. My empirical analysis, it draws from ethnographic research, which I undertook in 2015 and 2016 in Setúbal, a city of roughly 120,000 residents located 50 kilometers south of Portugal's capital city. Setúbal is a particularly well-suited site for ethnographic research on people's everyday responses to economic transition in crisis. Once a prosperous industrial city, it has suffered decline through deindustrialization and high unemployment through much of the 20th century, as well as ineffective top-down regional development plans backed by EU funds following Portugal's accession to the EU in 1986. Setúbal was also one of the areas of the country most affected by the 2008 financial crisis and ensuing austerity measures. I will focus on this paper on the articulation of various forms of care work, predominantly undertaken by women, that define and fulfill the material and immaterial needs of impoverished working-class households amidst unemployment, the lack of steady sources of monetary income, welfare retrenchment, and the degradation of the entitlements of citizenship. What I will do is I will explore the moral grounds and relational structure of the needs claims that mediate the practices, motivations, and dilemmas entailed in different kinds of care work, paid and unpaid, across public and private divides, within and between households. I will argue that under conditions of austerity welfare, women's care work and caring relationships have ultimately operated as a form of distributive agency. That is, care networks and caring practices enable the transfer, circulation, and allocation of material livelihood resources and claims-making instruments, thereby promoting and sustaining the agency needs of those being cared for. I begin by examining how working-class women in Setúbal identified and justified their individual and household needs according to different livelihood spheres of concern. This notion of livelihood spheres of concern I'm taking from Andrew Sawyer's work, who pointed us to pay attention to the relevance of attending to people's relations with the world as one of concern, which cannot be reduced to conventional, emotional, or subjective attachments. In the context of women's articulations of different forms of care work to fulfill individual and household needs, livelihood spheres of concern define conceptions of vulnerability and well-being grounded in moral values and relations of interdependency, obligation, and responsibility. I then turn to examine how women's caring labors and efforts to fulfill their material and immaterial needs involved a valuation of livelihood conditions and an evaluation of the possibilities for preventing or promoting change. In particular, I examine how women's moral evaluation of human needs was deployed to demand particular claims, entitlements, and rights. In the conclusion, I discuss how the needs-grounded morality of distribution and recognition underpinning women's care work and caring relationship operated as a form of distributive agency, and its broader implications for expanding liberal notions of well-being tied to autonomy, rationality, and freedom. While the austerity welfare regime in Portugal severely devalued human needs, the driving forces behind the destruction of jobs, wage cuts, welfare conditionality, diminished expectations, and livelihood impoverishment were not specific to the country. In Portugal and elsewhere, the policies of austerity entailed three major discontinuities, strongly shaping emergent regimes of austerity welfare. In the role and functions of the welfare state, in the financialization of capital extraction, and in the breakdown of the models and expectations of social reproduction. The austerity policies of spending cuts, privatizing healthcare and welfare reform, always followed by the moral censure of those who had been living above their means, contributed to redefining moral obligations between citizens and the state, entailing the retrenchment of people's sense of citizenship entitlements and expectations of livelihoods improving over generations. This was facilitated by the fetishization of sovereign debt as the determining national collective obligation, a process through which financial capital has historically captured the national state's fiscal policies. Laura Baer, for instance, has argued that this capture led to the submission of people's needs, moralities, and socialities to a universe of calculi, pervaded by destitution and abstraction. Indeed, in Portugal, as well as in the other so-called PIGS countries, in the years immediately following the sovereign debt crisis, politicians' embrace of technical terms such as public debt, deficit, the spread of public bonds, and fiscal adjustment served in part to depoliticize and naturalize growing social inequality and class polarization directly linked to the fiscal policies of austerity. It is well documented by now that the fiscal policies of austerity have fueled a violent crisis of social reproduction, affecting people's ability to ensure even their physical reproduction, illustrated in the pronounced rise of food banks or the growing number of homeless people. The policies of austerity have ushered also in a dynamics of reversal, undermining people's hopes and expectations of a life worth living, to quote Susan Narodsky, for themselves and the next generation. So what I designate as austerity welfare, in a way, refers to this particular conjuncture in which different livelihood spheres and scales have contributed to a reconfiguration of the articulation of the needs of states, capital, and the people, with the devaluation and subordination of the latter to the former. In Portugal, some statistical indicators regarding the human and social costs of austerity are illustrative of this devaluation of human needs. According to the National Institute of Statistics, in the second quarter of 2012, more than 1 million people, within a total active population of only 5 million, were either unemployed or living in conditions of intensified labor precarity. 18.7% of the adult working population, which is close to 2 million people, had to survive on an average monthly wage of 409 euros, which according to the government meant they were living below the poverty line. Levels of immigration rose to parallel those of the 1960s during the dictatorship. The policies of austerity reinforced a harsh economic recession with decidedly uneven effects upon the population. Even before their implementation, Portugal was already one of the more unequal countries in Europe in terms of income distribution. Austerity reinforced this pattern, affecting in particular the disposable income of the poorest 10% of households. 1/5 of households were affected by the consequences of unemployment, expressed in individuals' inability to ensure their organic survival and pay for housing, utilities, healthcare, and education. The material and economic strain experienced by households and individuals had consequences for psychological and mental well-being, with the suicide rate climbing from 8.6 in every 100,000 inhabitants in 2006 to 10.1 in 2013. So under these conditions of austerity welfare, how did ordinary people in Portugal identify and justify their needs? In 2016, I once asked Anna, one of my research participants, living in a household with her husband and son, how she organized her weekly preparation of meals. She explained to me the importance of hunting for local supermarket discounts, particularly for more expensive items such as meat and fish. Stocking up in advance was not an option as money was in short supply. She took advantage of the discounts and planned what to cook, trying to accommodate her husband and son's tastes. This was not the first time that Anna and her husband had experienced difficulties in sustaining the household. In 1999, they acquired a joint bank loan so she could open a small sewing business, which they had to close following the 2008 financial crisis. In 2010, due to the lack of other possibilities, Anna started working as a private cleaner. Her husband migrated to Scotland to work in a frozen fish factory. In 2016, he returned to Portugal to be an unskilled worker in a local sugar factory. The care work involved in household budgeting, shopping, planning meals, cooking and cleaning was for Anna, as for too many other women, motivated by instrumental, effective and moral reasons tied to livelihood spheres of concern, cross-cutting present and future temporalities. Anna did not disguise the physical and emotional tiredness of having to manage the daily threats to her livelihood while struggling to ensure that her son would be in the future a subject of value. Anna was proud that her son was completing a master's program at the university, and neither she nor her husband expected him to work for wages while studying. It was important for them that their son could pursue a better livelihood, uma vida melhor, through studying, an opportunity they never had. Although she knew that the university degree was no guarantee of stable employment, her son obtaining a degree and the need to ensure a sense of future was something Anna acted upon through care with and against the precarious present. My visits to Anna's household often took place after work, during weekdays or on weekends. I would arrive early in the evening and Anna would be starting to prepare dinner. Neighbors or friends would often pass by to leave fresh vegetables or fish that had not been sold that day at the market. Investing in relations of trust and reciprocity with friends, neighbors, and acquaintances served to uphold informal distributive networks shaped by the constant flow of resources, similar to the domestic network studied by Carol Steck in the 1970s. Most of the working class women I met in Setúbal identified and justified the fulfillment of their own and their household members' needs by referring to livelihood spheres of concern along the lines of kin, generation, and networks of friends and acquaintances. These guided how women mobilized care work as a basis for action to assess and redistribute material and immaterial resources considered essential for survival and self-worth, to minimize material vulnerability, and to enhance interdependent modalities of well-being. The caring dilemmas women had to confront, for example, taking on further waged or non-wage work so that younger household members would not have to work for wages, managing tensions and conflicts with neighbors to maintain access to informal distributed networks, constituted livelihood trade-offs. I emphasize livelihood trade-offs rather than choice to stress that individual preferences and self-interest did not ultimately determine the negotiations of tension and conflict. Instead, caring dilemmas entailed livelihood trade-offs underpinned by a normative ethics of livelihood reproduction shaped by interdependency, obligation, and responsibility towards the vulnerability and well-being of oneself and others. For the working class women I followed, the existence of needs implied a valuation of livelihood conditions and, as I said earlier in the beginning, an evaluation of the possibilities for pursuing or preventing change. Needs triggered what I call a morally grounded valuation of how to minimize the material vulnerability of those in need and an evaluation of how best to promote and sustain their claims, aspirations, and hopes. Caring for the needs of others and using these needs as a vernacular morality of claims to resources and entitlements was particularly proeminent in the caring labors undertaken between women of different generations, within and between households, crossing public and private divides. Let me provide an example, which I hope is clear, because it involves several households. Sarah was 51 when I met her in 2015, a part-time cleaner in a private medical office, lived with her second partner, 2 daughters, and 1 son from previous marriage. In the same neighborhood, in another house, lived her sister and her mother, and in another, her eldest daughter. The house where Sarah lived was part of a social housing project run through a partnership between the municipality and a private company. The tenancy contract was in the name of Sarah's mother. Sarah explained to me that moving the tenancy contract to her name would mean losing the possibility of maintaining a low and socially conditioned rent. Sarah's mother moved to her sister's house when Sarah's first partner, the father of her children, died. This was a difficult moment as Sarah found herself with few resources to sustain herself and her children. Over time, ensuring that the municipal authorities remained unaware of the arrangement enabled the fulfillment of various needs, as I will explain. I followed Sarah's daily care tasks between households and throughout the city. In the mornings, she would do the housework of her own household, preparing meals for everyone, washing and ironing clothes, cleaning the house. Sometimes she would go shopping and deliver her mother's groceries to her house. In the afternoons, she would go to work, except when she took her mother to the medical center or to the Social Security Bureau. Sarah felt obliged to follow her mother to the Social Security Bureau because, as she said, they tend to think that just because we live in social housing, we are less worthy. And if you can't read or write, which was her mother's case, you can't defend yourself. Towards the end of my fieldwork, her eldest daughter gave birth. Sarah began taking care of her eldest daughter's baby in the mornings, and her 2 daughters began helping with housework. Taking the baby to a nursery was not an option. There was no public nursery network, and the private ones were too expensive. Sarah once recounted how her son had returned home after having his wages pawned due to an unpaid debt to a private credit agency. So in sum, Sarah's caring labors sustained the emotional, relational, and affective capacities that enabled others to exercise agency beyond the sphere of the household, in encounters with the state services, as the case with her mother, in overcoming dependency on a credit institution with her son, and to be a worker and a mother, the case of her eldest daughter. Diane Elson notes that under conditions of economic crisis and structural adjustment, household strategies to confront the reallocation of resources at larger scales are not only symptoms of survival, but may become engines of transformation. Struggle is what bridges the gap between survival and transformation, involving or including struggles to maintain, promote, change, or sustain the moral value of needs. The efforts of working class women in Setúbal to respond to the needs of household members, extended family, and loved ones were grounded in a morally oriented valuation and evaluation of needs. Caring with concern and acting upon the needs of others was not driven by arbitrary definitions of deservingness, but centered on fulfilling claims and expectations of human worth and changing entitlements to resources. Following Nancy Fraser, women's care work reinstated an embedded definition of need, acting upon the ongoing, contested, and negotiated interpretative dimensions of needs. In conclusion, I want to draw attention to the normative and moral underpinnings guiding women's care efforts, investments, and practices under conditions of austerity welfare, and how these might be, and this is my analytical hypothesis, might be best conceptualized as a form of distributive agency. When I asked my female interlocutors what motivated them to pursue multiple and demanding efforts, what despite everything kept them going, they answered, because I want my son to have a better life, to go to university, because I have to help my daughter to maintain her work, because I want to ensure my grandsons don't feel hunger, because I want my mother to be treated with dignity at this stage of her life, because my son is unemployed, because they deserve better. These were not the only explanations, but the most recurrent ones. I am not suggesting that women accepted without complaints the sacrificial vocation of fulfilling the needs of others. What I wish to highlight are the moral and ethical premises underpinning what they care for, what they value, and evaluate as being worthy of struggling for. What mattered most to the women I came to know was minimizing the risk that the agency of those they care for would be compromised in the present and in the future. Their care work sought to fulfill needs required to exercise agency, not in spite of, but because their actions were grounded in the ethical premises of vulnerability, interdependency, relationality, obligation, and affect among kin, family, friends, and neighbors. Their care work went beyond conceptions of human agency based on the tenets of rationality, autonomy, and independence, which are very much exposed by orthodox economics and liberal philosophy. Their care work underscored the importance of attending to immediate material needs, those that increase the autonomous capacity of individuals through the provision of food, shelter, clothing, and money, as well as their interdependent and relational abilities through affect, support, and encouragement to claim worth, value, and recognition in the present and in the future, and in private, public, and institutional settings. James Ferguson has explored recently what he called the new politics of distribution, focusing on the expansion of direct social cash transfers in the global south and how these are linked with emerging political forms of claims making and new possibilities for political mobilization. The author has sought to value the realm of distributive practices and their underlying rationalities, which have long been the target of a general gender disdain, which tends to associate non-productive distributive livelihoods with dependency, feminine subordination, and domestic sphere. Ferguson, on the contrary, stresses the relevance of attending to the logics, moralities, and rationalities underpinning distributive dependent livelihoods in national context shaped by growing contingents of surplus labor. Taking inspiration from Ferguson's analysis, I want to suggest that in conditions of austerity welfare, shaped by massive expulsion from the labor market, economic insecurity, deprivation of state welfare provisioning, and citizenship dispossession, women's various forms of care work in Portugal enabled to pool, allocate, hoard, transfer, and access resources considered necessary to fulfill material and recognition needs required to exercise agency. In other words, women's networks of care, practices, and relationships operated as a channel of distributive agency, sustaining the legitimacy and fulfillment of the material needs of survival, aspirations of worth, and claims making, which enhance the agency of the recipients of care. While a significant tendency in welfare theory tends to link the development of agentive disposition and capacities to the expansion of people's capabilities for freedom and autonomy, and I'm thinking about Amartya Sen title, Development as Freedom, the specificity of the modus operandis of care as distributive agency resides in grounding and sustaining people's agency needs of livelihood conditions of being and possibilities of becoming by nurturing their abilities of interdependence, relationality, obligation, and affect. Distributive agency operates not by the expansion of substantive freedoms alone, but also through the expansion, sustenance, and maintenance of substantive networks of care and sociality, which secure the circulation and allocation of various kinds of individual and collective agency resources, enabling the material autonomy of recipients, as well as their capabilities to make claims and articulate the legitimacy of their entitlements. Scholars working from the perspective of a feminist ethic of care emphasize that the practice and activity of care is underpinned by the moral and context-bounded values of responsibility, relationships, and obligation, particularly vis-à-vis meeting the needs of others. The latter configure a form of politics which is not centered on the tenets of rationality, universality, and utilitarian self-maximizing dispositions, but rather grounds the development of human capacities in sociality and interdependency. As argued by Joan Tronto, care as a political idea and set of normative practices departs from the premise that human beings are essentially interdependent and that the degree of human needing is not the same for all individuals. Hence, the caring work practices of attentiveness, responsibility, and responsiveness described for Tronto what she called the qualities necessary for democratic citizens to live together well in a pluralistic society. In a similar vein, the notion of care as distributive agency aims to designate how, under conditions of austerity welfare, the ethics and activities of care of working class women in Portugal serve the purpose of promoting, nurturing, and maintaining agency through interdependence, relationality, obligation, and affect. In doing so, women's caring labors and practices show that the logic, orientations, and abstractions of austerity are not a mechanically internalized, totalizing framework of action, thought, and perception. Rather, the hidden political level of care as distributive agency lies precisely in expressing a struggle to counter the devaluing of human needs at the core of austerity welfare, while asserting the irreducibility of people's inherent vulnerability and the relational quality of their longings, expectations, and hopes. Thank you, and I'll stop here.
Thank you, Patricia. That was really nice. Do you have questions? I have a question too, but I will first give you the opportunity to ask questions.
Thank you for your talk. It was very interesting and very connected to what I'm working on at the moment with finishing my dissertation. And I think I thought it was interesting what you were talking about in terms of the agency, and that it's not so much a relinquishment of their agency on an individual level, if I understood what you were saying correctly, but that there's this underpinning of a collective sort of normative idea that drives, is sort of the engine to the means to which they're arriving at, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Did I? I'm not quite.
And now I can't hear you.
Interesting in light of what I'm working on. Oh, can you hear me? I'm sorry.
Now I can.
Okay, perfect. That was not so much a question, but just a very interesting point in light of what I'm working on at the moment, because I had been analyzing something through the perspective of that it was sort of giving up one's agency, and that was sort of to an extent an overall negative, wherein it's really, that's interesting to think about it in terms of a collective moral good, so to speak, if I understood what you were saying. So not so much a question, but
no, yeah, but maybe I'll pick up on your comment, maybe as a way to clarify this, the moral underpinnings of care, and how I see that as a form of promoting and fulfilling agency. And this is because when I started writing about this, so right after fieldwork, so during fieldwork actually, something which emerged immediately, and for me it was not a novelty, being someone who has worked about Southern Europe context, was the relevance of networks of distribution of resources so that people could live in situations of crisis and transition. So this was my first observation, but then what I started notice was that most of this distribution of resources was being done by women. And then the other thing that I started notice was that they were doing it with care, that is, their actions, their practical actions were always underpinned by a moral ethic of care towards the needs of others. And then the next step was I started asking myself, what are they distributing when they care for people? Is it only resources, that is material or immaterial, material in the sense of food, shelter, support when people are depressed, or in terms of immaterial resources, helping people to confront the state, for instance. And then what emerged was this idea of, yes, when they are caring for people, what they are distributing is agency in the present and in the long term for these people. Because the resources that they are giving to them through care and with care, it will enable so many others to maintain their agency now, but also to project a different form of agency in the future. And that's how this idea of distributive agency came along, in fact. And also because I was, at the same time, I was reading a lot about welfare theory, and I was reading a lot James Ferguson and Amartya Sen, which was an author which I always enjoyed very much reading. But then when I came to this research, what I understood, and also by reading Martha Nussbaum and others, was Sen relies on a notion of agency, which in fact has influenced a lot the way that policy making is done, which is a top-down version of agency. It's this idea of agency being nurtured by increasing people's abilities of autonomy, of freedom, of self-sufficiency, which is also a very neoliberal inflected rhetoric, in fact, now that I think of it. And I was seeing the opposite from the bottom up. So I was seeing that these women, through caring, they were promoting a different form of agency, which didn't rely so much on increasing people's abilities of being independent, but rather on the contrary, it was on promoting people's abilities to be dependent, to share on one another, to rebuild networks of collective solidarity, of mutual aid, this at the scale of the neighborhood, for instance, which was something which I didn't, in fact, talk a lot about. So yes, so this was, in a nutshell, what drove me to think about the possibilities, the analytical possibilities of this notion of care as a form of distributive agency, and also, of course, the possibilities of this notion, idea, analytical device, whatever we want to call it, to be applied to other contexts, to have a broader applicability. Yeah.
Thank you for expanding on that. It's really very useful for me. I'm sure everyone else. Thank you.
Michele.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for your presentation. I have my own dissertation back in my mind. It's something very recent, and it was wonderful to see how somehow both researches match, but from a different angle. So let's say I don't have an economic anthropology background, and I'm not so familiar with this literature, but in a way, the child narratives I've been studying during all these years somehow show most of what you presented. So let's say that the working class children I worked with, both migrant and non-migrant, and with very different mobility trajectories, but all affected by precariousness and the kind of livelihood instability that results from this, actually acknowledge this collective dimension of agency and this collective dimension of care. And I'm particularly thinking of a publication that is part of my dissertation that precisely deals with children affected by housing insecurity and by evictions in Spain. And we talk about narratives of hope. And these narratives of hope are narrative strategies put forth by the children, which actually highlight the collective dimension of the family and household strategies. So something that affects the group, and whatever the group means. And also de-responsibilizes the domestic group of the negative situation in which they found. So it's like a de-victimizing narratives. And third, it highlights the potential agency of both the group and the children themselves. And this is connected to maybe the question that I have is could you explore further the intergenerational dimension of this distributive agency? Because you talked about a specific case with an old mother and also some children. So let's say age plays a role here. My take is, of course, from the children's perspectives, but I'm very curious to know how do you perceive this from your analytical angle, let's say. And thanks again.
Yeah, no, thank you for the question. In terms of the intergenerational dimension of this of care as distributive agency, there were two situations in particular which struck me immediately at the beginning of fieldwork, and then that I saw them overly and overly again being practiced. The first one was the relationship between older women already retired, which were earning very good pensions, and younger sons, young sons or daughters who were presently on unemployment and who were actually being supported in being able to have a livelihood due to the pensions of their mothers or grandmothers. So there was a sort of a pattern of, how shall I say, a very feminized pattern of transfer of resources among generations in this sense, in the terms of the pensions of the grandmothers and parents to the youngsters. And that this was a way of these people being able of confronting what were what was a very harsh decrease of welfare benefits during the austerity period. This was a very noticeable feminized pattern of transfer of resources and by consequence of distributive agency as well. And the other one was between mothers and sons, mothers and daughters particular, when there was a project of building a new family. For instance, if the daughter became pregnant, or it had to combine job with nursery, but could not pay for the private nursery. This was another pattern. But now that you ask for this, to rethink this intergenerational dimension, I would say that it was the most proeminent in terms of the feminization of the distribution of agency through care, alongside another one, which happened at the scale of the neighborhood. And I'm not sure if this is something which could be generalized to other places, because I was working in a very working class neighborhood, a fishing neighborhood. And if there is one thing that the literature has already documented a lot, is the existence of a class solidarity in moments of crisis and transition. Sometimes I think it tends to be obscured and sidelined, particularly by political agents, which are always trying to hide that this working class solidarity exists and it's real. So another pattern that I noticed in terms of care as distributive agents was at the scale of the neighborhood, between neighbors, which worked in different sorts of professions, but which would help one another by exchanging resources. Like if there was one neighbor working in the fish market and another one which has a little self portion of land for agricultural production, they would trade the resources. And this was maintained for a long time. So to respond to your answer, to your question, the intergenerational dimension of the distribution of agency through care was parallel to this other one at the scale of the neighborhood. Yeah. I'm not sure if I replied to your, was it this that you were looking for?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. It was more an invitation to reflect on this. Thanks.
Yeah.
Just to add, we did a research on poverty also related with these public cuts and everything, you know, and precarity. And it is interesting because we found out that particularly in families or people living within families, ordinary families, were particularly the women who took care of emotionally, and also who went to search for help in charities and, you know, who took the lead to make all the movements. And usually the breadwinner, let's say the man, usually get depressed at home, and was the woman who took care, who went to you know, who created the links and these solidarity links and everything. So it was the active one. We were studying the relational vulnerability. It means that how the poverty impacts the social relationships. And this particular case, in the case of women being part of a traditional family, if you wish, was contradictory in the sense that they had this big network of family, strong networks around, but they didn't take much care about her own emotional support, in a sense. So they were limited. They were protected by the family, in a sense, but they don't have any access to social relationships outside the family. So it was a kind of paradox there. But actually, everything what you said resonates really clearly in our own research, Amanda's and our own. So that's interesting. If you apply this social network analysis, you can really see how, you know, the emotionalist support is delivered, and how is the structure of the family, what is the centrality of these women in particular. So yeah, really interesting. Yeah.
Now that you mentioned I think I know the word. I think I know the word because I read an article written by you, I think, and another person from the what was the name? What's the name of the journal? Annals of Political and something.
Yeah, Miranda, she's the one.
Okay. Sorry about that.
Yeah.
So I read the introduction to the special issue, which was very interesting, and also the one written by Mercedes de la Rocha, which I like her very much for a very long time now. And yes, about charity, what I wanted to add is that this fieldwork of mine, it happened in different places. So while I was doing the research on the households, the focus was the households. I was at the same time going like 3 times a week to a charity in a Catholic church parish. And I was following the way that the food baskets were being arranged. I was following the way that the interviews were being taken between the volunteers of the church and the people who were going there to ask for help. And I'm actually, I submitted a book chapter like 2 weeks ago about that, about charity and the morality of inequality as well. And I also noticed the same thing, that it were again the women which were going to seek resources and then come back to distribute these same resources to their own families, or even to extended close families and friends in the neighborhood. What you are mentioning about the lack of emotional support which is given to women themselves, it's something that I started to think while I was preparing this paper, actually, about the way that while I emphasize throughout my paper the benefits of care as a form of distributive agency, it's also true that I can see how this same form of distributing agency through care can lead to inequalities, not only to good things. It can also be a way of removing the agency. And in the case of these women, it's true that their agency was often subordinated to all these mechanics at the collective level and at the family level. Yes.
Yeah. Just to add, we could speak for hours, I think. We did. That is you mentioned is the first research we did with Miranda on general. I mean, we collected 60 cases, but in the second one I was mentioned was another one, a second one with Jose Luis Molina and Miranda also. And it's interesting because, as you mentioned now, we detected what we told toxic ties, in a sense that those women, they had to fight.
That's a good one.
They had to struggle, particularly with husbands, let's say.
Exactly.
Because they didn't support at all. Even though they struck support to the women, So they it's interesting in the way you put it. I didn't think in terms of agency or future agency as you put it, but it's interesting as well. So I will leave the rest of the people, but thank you very much for your talk.
Thank you.
No, to relate to that, I was wondering exactly to relate to this paper in the annals and so on as well. When relationships break down, so to speak, right? So also relating to Mercedes' work there are these sort of networks that function, but at some point they break down, right? And in this case, I thought, well, you already gave partially an answer with Kel's question, where you said maybe there's this working class neighborhood, and maybe there's the answer, right? That in the neighborhood there is this sociality that is not always taking place in other places, and this also relates to Clara Hans' book, which you may know.
Yeah.
But another thing that I wanted to ask is actually with this concept of distributive agency, if this also relates somehow to the dispossession concept of Butler and Athanasiou. So as you said, it is a bit further away from Amartya Sen's concept, and dispossession is a little bit more like also seeing the taking away of the autonomy, but also creating transformation, right? So I was wondering to what extent you related to that.
Yeah, no, thank you. It does. I mean, the work of Butler, it was not my main. It was not my main source of inspiration, but I took it into account when I was thinking through how to conceptualize this notion of distributive agency. And I think what I took from Butler was this idea that there is a common vulnerability, a common precariousness to everyone, which is independent of particular forms of living. So I took this idea with me, and also Butler's idea that that the main distinction, if we can call it that, between precarity and precariousness, it's because precariousness involves a certain political and economic arrangement which somehow distributes different degrees of vulnerability to the bodies of people, to their own embodied precarity. And when I was thinking through with this distinction of Butler, I think what I wanted to do was to overcome this distinction by saying that yes, it is in part a common condition to everyone, that there is that we are human beings, and by being human beings, by being interdependent with others and with needs, we live precariously. But I wanted to see the precise processes, the precise forms of living, of caring, through which this precarity is confronted by people. Not so much by the economic and political arrangement, as she was very much interested when she wrote The Precarious Life right after the 9/11 attacks. But I wanted to see the specificity, in part because of Clara Hahn as well, because of listening to a talk that she gave, by reading the book, and by seeing a lot of resemblances in the way that those poor families that she followed somehow retained a sense of possibility of agency in spite of everything. Yeah. The first part of your question about the dark side, let's say, of care as distributive agency is something that, to be completely honest, I am still trying to incorporate. I'm quite, in an empirical sense, I'm quite aware of that. I'm quite aware that care is not only, it doesn't only have a good side, it also has its opposite. But I'm still trying to find the best way to articulate that with the empirical data that I have. And now I realize at a distance that probably one of the disadvantages, if we want to call it that, of doing fieldwork in a very, very, in a working class neighborhood shaped by a very strong memory of communist solidarity, because it was the case with this neighborhood, sometimes blocks the possibility of being able to see where the cracks are. So yes, the dark side of care as distributive agency is something that it's now on the top of my mind. For women themselves, it's clear that that the time and the effort and the energy and the investment that they put in caring for the needs of others, it's something, it's beyond exhausting. What I could see during taking into account the harshness of the austerity here in Portugal, but not only, it's unbearable. The more recent hypothesis which I started raising about this dark side of care as distributive agency in conditions of transition and crisis and disruption in the means of livelihood, reproduction, is that, and it's very much by going back to the old literature on care in Southern Europe, but also on patronage, etc. It's this hypothesis that I raised that that austerity, as other economic orthodoxies, could be somehow very much dependent on particular common sense or ideologies of care regimes. And if we accept this hypothesis of valid, because we see it now, even during the pandemic crisis, those that are caring and being exposed are mostly women. But if we hypothesize that economic regimes, in order to become, or economic orthodoxies, in order to become legitimate and efficient and productive, have to rely on these ideologies of care regimes, then we can see how care as a distributive agency can also give rise to new inequalities, not only the nurturing of possibilities of agency in the future. So this is an hypothesis which I have been working in terms of writing and thinking through to answer to the first part of your question, which it's a question that has been on my mind for a long time now.
Well, it's very interesting, this hypothesis, indeed. So thank you. José Luis.
Yeah, Patricia, so thank you for your talk. We are thinking about it. I have some problems with the idea of distributive agency, because it's an oxymoron in itself, because it's talking about individuals, and almost the same is talking about groups and solidarities and okay, but it's like other concepts like network individualism, so that are useful for understanding what is going on. I would suggest you to think on the idea about the idea of vicarious social capital, because if you talk about vicarious social capital, you are stressing that this capital is invisible. It's provided by invisible women providing care, you know, and they are, in a sense, controlled by their values, because they have deep values in order to reproduce, you know, the household or the group. But it's the oldest history in the world. Some people are, you know, helping you to do things, right? And this work by nature is invisible. Is the work of slavery. Is the work of you know, workers. Is the work of I don't know. So yeah, I think I understand your idea. It's more than just simply empower others. It's more than simply providing care and taking care of others. It's but there is something of cross agencies and the enacting of new situations. But I still think that it needs just a bit more, you know, a step ahead. It's just my impression, my humble impression. I'm not a specialist. It's just thinking aloud after your ideas and your comments, right? Nothing.
Okay, no, thank you. No, thanks. And you think that in order to go that bit ahead, which is still not in the point, maybe look up this notion of precarious social capital. It's a good way.
I talk about vicarious, because vicarious means that you are next to someone, and it comes from Veblen. The idea is come from Veblen, 19th century, right? This the idea of vicarious something, right? But I don't know. This is not important. What is important is try to find the appropriate label for your concept, because you are able to explain your concept at the potentialities of your concept. But I think still deserves a new, more adjusted label, words to denotate it, right?
Yeah.
Congratulations,
Yeah.
right?
No, thanks. Now, I also think so. I agree with you. I totally agree with you. And recently, what I've tried to do, and it was also while I was preparing this talk, was a debate that goes on in Portugal for a very long time now, which I think that it also, in Spain, you are also aware of it, which was this notion introduced in the late 1980s, early 1990s by Boaventura Sousa Santos on the idea that Portugal was a sort of welfare society and not yet a welfare state, which in fact is true, and his analyses are very good. And what I started thinking, now that Jose mentioned this notion of precarious social capital, was I started thinking the welfare society as a sort of social capital that people could rely on in order to face and mitigate the lack of support from the state. And then I started thinking that maybe one way to further develop the idea of care as a form of distributive agency would be to compare it with this old notion of welfare capital or family welfare model of the Southern European context. Yeah, so.
No more questions? Well, thank you so much, Patricia, for this really wonderful talk. It's very inspiring. And thank you all for assisting as well. And well, see you next time.